Let's try that again. Good morning. Okay, that's better. It's good to see all of y'all this morning. Um, I was thinking about this month and realizing that Easter is almost here, and that means some of us will be heading off to Dallas. So this is going to be a relatively short month for sermon series, and so we're going to be talking about the resurrection, but we're going to be looking at it from a few different angles. We're going to begin by just discussing the main principle behind what it is seemingly like for someone to have who have died, but yet they now live. That whole idea, that whole concept that makes up the framework of that idea of the gospel and the resurrection. And then we're going to spend some time talking about how it affects us, our life, as we live out in the shadow of the resurrection, as we live resurrected lives. So that's what we're going to be expecting this month. And then Emery will be coming in and spending some time. I'm always grateful that he is able and willing to do that. And so he'll be filling in on Easter Sunday, and then we'll be back at it shortly after that. And then next thing you know, it'll be graduation, and then summer, and then we're going to get to start all over again. So that's how that works. But we're gonna move through with this sermon series, Risen. This is going to be our main idea and theme. We've been spending some time in the book of Genesis this year, and the stories we have been reading in Genesis have often foreshadowed future events, and we've taken the time to look at some of those. And I think it's important for us to do that, to make that connection between these stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament realities that kind of go behind them. We've talked about stories like the flood story with Noah, and that expectation that someday God is going to wipe away disobedient man from the earth, and that he's going to bring about a new reality, that expectation that we have as Christians foreshadowed in this idea. We also looked at stories like Joseph and how he being handed over by his brothers to slavery, to death, ultimately led to not only Joseph's exaltation, that he was exalted to a position, but ultimately led to the salvation of the very people in which who handed him over. And as Christians on this side of the cross, we look back at these stories and we can see Jesus. We look back at these stories and we can see God's plan to ultimately save humanity from this perverse generation. And that's what we get to see. And so this morning's story is one of those. It's one of those stories in the Old Testament that foreshadows future events that as Christians we look back at and we recognize. But we're going to be talking about Abraham, and we're going to be talking about Isaac in Genesis 22. So if you want to look at that in your copy of the Bible, then you're welcome to turn there. It will be on the screen if you would like to look at that as well. One thing I'd like to note is as we look at Old Testament stories, I want us to recognize that these stories, and I call them stories. I know they're historical accounts, but that's just a mouthful. So they're stories, and they're real stories, but they make more sense when we view them in light of what we know as Christians. So as Christians, we have, the rest of that story, and we can look back at these and we can see more clearly what was going on and what God intended for these messages. But likewise, I think it's equally important to recognize that the New Testament makes more sense with the Old Testament as its background, as its framework. So in both ways, if we're reading the Old Testament or the New, it makes more sense when we have the whole Bible as our guide in understanding the text. So let's spend some time in Genesis 22 and talk about Abraham and his faith. In Genesis 22, I want to jump forward a little bit to verse 18. This is a verse that has been mentioned before, a little bit different. It changes each time, but it is a promise that God gave to Abraham. Remember, Abraham is called out, is called Abram at this point, and he is called out of his country, his nation, for a purpose. And God made promises to Abram. And that starts off in Genesis 12 as we begin to read about this man that God calls out of the world. But in Genesis 22 and verse 18, oh, excuse me, and I don't even have that on my slide. Sorry. All right, you either just listen or you can read it in the text yourself. It says, this is God speaking to Abram, and he says, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Now, this is after an event that we're going to be talking about this morning, but nonetheless, it fits into our context. It fits into this idea that there are some fulfillments here, the beginnings of, the genesis of a fulfillment of some promises that God made to Abraham that would ultimately result in the blessing of all nations. In fact, we today are recipients of what God is doing through this man. And so here's Abraham. He's 75 years old. At least we think he's around that age when he first is told about becoming a great nation. And then after all this period of time, he's 100 years old when God finally gives him a son, and that son of promise. And we would like to think, if we're thinking about Abraham, our hero of faith, we would like to think that Abraham and his wife Sarai waited patiently for the Lord to fulfill his promise, and that they waited and they had faith and they were obedient, and that's the story. But unfortunately, like most of these stories, that's not the story. In fact, Abraham and his wife, they try to help God along, knowing that they were getting older, knowing that it seemingly wasn't going to happen. They decided that they were going to do things on their own to make this promise come to reality, so that a son would be born. And Sarai gives her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, and they have a son. And it wasn't what God wanted. And things just got messy, which is the way things are when we try to help God out in fulfilling his promise. Things get messy, and the relationship gets messy, and it just causes trouble for Abram and his family. But then in Genesis 22, it picks up the story later. So God does indeed give Sarai a son. Even though she was barren and even though she was older in age, she still has a son of promise. And so we're skipping forward to when Isaac is a teenager, roughly. So you can imagine being a teenager and being in this scenario. And so Genesis 22, starting in verse 1. Let's read that together. It says, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains in which I shall tell you. So Abraham, he gets his stuff and he runs. He just runs away as far as he can so that God will never find him, and takes his son with him. Is that how the story goes? Is that how you remember the story? No, he doesn't. He doesn't do any of that. Abraham is a man of an extraordinary faith, and he's been through a lot. We have to understand that this man in his age has been through a tremendous amount. He's seen so much, and he has matured so much as the story has unfolded, but he doesn't just run as we may expect him to do. In fact, the text doesn't even tell us what kind of emotions he was feeling. We don't even know that he was upset or he was sad or he was angry. We don't know what he was feeling. We can imagine, as those of us who are parents or grandparents, we can imagine that there are feelings, that there are emotions involved here. We can imagine feelings like anguish. We can imagine hurt, sorrow, and disappointment, and all these emotions that may follow this, but we don't know what Abraham's feeling, but we can imagine what it must have been like. But Abraham was a man of faith, and he trusted God, and he was willing to obey God, although he may have had these feelings of doubt and anguish and sorrow and pain, which we don't know, but we can imagine. but he was a man of faith. And then in verse 3, it says, so Abraham, he rose early in the morning. I mean, if he had chosen any day to sleep in, this would have been it. But he rose early in the morning and he saddled his donkey and he took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and he rose and he went to the place in which God had told him. And then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and he saw the place afar off. You see, when God calls people, when he calls us, when he calls people, we have a choice. There's a choice that a person makes when they're called. You can either ignore the calling. You can attempt to run, and we have stories about people who attempted to hide from God, people like Jonah, who attempted to run from God because he didn't want to do what God was asking him to do. Or people even like Adam and Eve at the beginning of the Bible, who, when they heard God, the wind come into the garden, they were afraid and they hid from God. There are responses that we may have in regards to when God calls us. And we see different scenarios. Abraham, when he was called, he rose early in the morning. He gathered the necessary things and he took his son and he went. But you can imagine Abraham as he's saddling his donkey and as he's cutting that wood and as he calls his son to himself and makes proper preparation, that there are times where he is thinking, what am I doing? What's going to happen? How is this going to end? How is God going to make this right? And even though we don't know, we can still imagine what it must have been like for him. And on that 3rd day, when Abraham lifted up his eyes and he saw the place in which God told him to go, right? Because we know what it feels like to get to a place where we're headed. Usually we feel pretty good about it. We're thinking, yes, this ride's over, the trip's over, it's all done, I'm at my destination. But at this point, I imagine Abraham would have enjoyed that trip to have been longer, just to allow time, just as long as it took to get to the place. But this 3rd day, he lifts up his eyes, he sees the place that God commanded him to go, and he goes. He continues to go. In verse 5, he says, and Abraham said to his younger men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. I know it's probably been pointed out to you before, but just notice the language, notice the words being used here. Abraham is telling his young men to stay and wait for them, right? We will go, the lad and I will go, but then that last phrase that we will come back to you. That Abraham is acknowledging the fact that he believes somehow God is going to fulfill his promise. Somehow God will be faithful to his commitment, that somehow something is going to happen. And at this point, all we know is that God has made a promise to Abraham, that that promise would be fulfilled through his son. Those are some known things in the story as we're moving through the text. That's what we know. And we know that Abraham is being faithful to God's command, but we don't really know all of what Abraham knows. We don't know if Abraham had some insight, which we assume he didn't. At this point in the story, there are some unknowns, but there are certainly some knowns. And I think that's where our faith comes in, isn't it? There are a lot of times in our life where we know we're supposed to do something. We know that God has made promises to us. We know that we have responsibilities to God, but there are a lot of unknowns. We don't know what life's going to bring. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how long we will live. We don't know if we will experience trauma and tragedy. We really don't know. But we do know that someday, regardless of what may happen in that journey, on that trip, as we are called and we are following God, that we know that the end of that destination will be sure. It will be certain that God has made promises that he will indeed keep. And this story helps us to realize that. as we read through it. So he cuts the wood and he makes the journey and he arrives at his destination. Verse 6. He says, so Abraham took the wood on the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went up together. So, being a little nerdy about words, I think that this is an important aspect of the story, is this word that is used in Hebrew for wood is the word eitz. And it's most commonly, especially in the Psalms, and even in Genesis, talking about the trees, to mean that, trees. It means trees. And so the idea is that Abraham, if you were to make a very, very literal translation, Abraham has taken the tree and he has placed it on his son's shoulders. And of course, as Christians, we look at that story and what do we think about? We think about Jesus and the cross. We think about God's only son having a tree that he bears, that he carries himself to a place of execution. That's what we think about. And I believe that's where we're supposed to be in that story, that we're supposed to be mindful of that and thinking about that as we imagine Isaac carrying his own tree up the mountain. And verse 7, it says, but Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am. Same words. Here I am, my son. And then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. So the two of them went together. God will provide the lamb. God will provide the sacrifice. Now, at the moment, God has provided. In Abraham's thinking, God has provided. God has provided Isaac. God has provided the son, in which he is committed to fulfilling a command from God to go and to offer. And so in the mind of Abraham, he has provided. But there's a sense in which we recognize that this idea of God providing the lamb has deep, deep theological roots in our own redemptive plan, or our own redemptive life, that we've been redeemed through God's plan, and that we recognize this whole idea is rooted in that concept, the only son, the son of promise, in which God will take, in essence, as a worship sacrifice. But look at verse 9. He says, then they came to the place of which God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there, placed the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And then Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the knife to slay his son. Now, we don't know, again, the details. We assume that at this point, Isaac is a willingly participating in this. It seems like he is, but we don't really know exactly how that story played out. But then again, we can imagine this scenario. We can imagine this taking place as Abraham takes his son, his boy, and he ties them up. He ties his feet, ties his hand like he would a sacrifice, and he lays it on the altar that has been prepared, that Isaac helped in the process, this whole process. The sacrifice is assisting in the sacrifice itself, and he lays them on the altar. He's prepared to do what God commanded him to do. And at this point, Abraham wasn't certain, again, what God had in mind. What's God going to do? What's the plan here? What's going to happen? And so at this point, we still don't know. We are left kind of in the shadows of not knowing, but knowing that Abraham is going to be faithful. All that we know is that God has provided the son in his own age. He has fulfilled that promise, and that God will fulfill his promise in the future to bless all nations through the seed of Abraham. That we do know. So we focus on the known in order to realize some of the unknowns that are coming up in this story. This trust that Abraham has in God, this faith that Abraham has in God. And out of faith, what do we see? Obedience, right? And we've talked about that before, that when we talk about faith, we're not talking about a pie in the sky idea. We're not talking about, some concept that somebody feels. Or somebody says, well, I have faith, and what they mean is they really don't know anything. They just have faith. But in the Bible, faith is often, and not if not always, coupled with this concept of obedience based on promises. That God has said, we have faith in God's willingness and abilities, and we respond with obedience. That's how faith in the Bible works. And we see that being played out in Abraham's life as he willingly and faithfully trusts and commits to God in obedience. In verse 11, this is the good part, right? Because Abraham's ready. He's already got the knife. He's prepared to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Every other time that he's been called, it hasn't always been great. I mean, first time he gets that call from God and he gets bad news. And then he gets a call from his son, which is kind of sobering for Abraham. But now this call from the angel of the Lord, I'm sure that he was ecstatic to respond to, right? Here I am. I'm here. Here I am. I'm ready to listen. And he stops, obviously, and he listens. But I can imagine that these words came out of his mouth much different than the other times we see it. In verse 12, and he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. I mean, what a relief, right? I mean, that's a relief for us, too, in this story. I mean, if you didn't know the end, most of us know the story and know the ending of the story, but if you didn't know the story and you were reading it for the first time, it's kind of a, edge of your seat kind of story, and you're thinking, what's going to happen? So it's a relief for us, too, to know that God has put a stop to this, that he recognizes the obedience of Abraham and the faithfulness of Abraham. But I think it's interesting or worth noting this word fear. This word fear. And I've mentioned this before, but I think it's important to note here this idea of fear in the Bible is often related to this understanding of who is greater. This concept of who is greater. We always fear what's greater, right? We fear what's greater. So we have fear of the dark because not everybody, but some of us do, right? I mean, it's a legitimate fear because we expect there to be something that's going to catch us off guard, that's going to be greater than us, that's lurking or hiding in the shadows. Or we might have fear of a disease because we have no control over it, and it's seemingly greater than we are. So we understand this concept of fear as being greater. But to recognize God is greater than is the idea of fearing the Lord. That God is greater than anything we may encounter in life. God is greater than what lurks in the shadows. God is greater than what disease may affect us. That God is greater than this concept that Abraham is offering his son. But to acknowledge that, to live that out, to be able to actually function in that reality is what he is being commended for, that he fears the Lord above all other things, that he fears the Lord. He considers God greater than. And if we were to assume some emotion from Abraham, which we're kind of doing because he is human, we might assume that at some point in Abraham's journey, that his emotions would have gotten the better of him. That at some point, Abraham would have responded out of emotion, and his emotions would have gotten the better of him, and his fear and his anguish and his distress may have caused them to have made some decisions that were much different than what we see in this text. Because the truth about that is our emotions can lie to us. Do you know that? Your emotions can lie to you. I know we've had this discussion with our kids, but there is such a thing as irrational fear. I mean, there's nothing to be afraid of, but for some reason, you're afraid. I don't know what that's all about. It's just a response. But your emotion can cause you to believe there's danger when there's not. Your emotion can cause you to make decisions based out of feeling that are not appropriate. That your emotions can lie to you. And I think even with our salvation and our security that we find emotions that lie to us. That we think, well, I either feel saved. I feel good. I feel saved. I believe I am. I guess I feel saved. And we might think, well, I guess I am. Everything's good because I have this feeling. But your emotions are not very good guides for accuracy of anything else in your life. I mean, why would we expect it to be a good guide for something as important as our relationship to God? But there may be times as Christians where we feel unsaved. Where it's like, I don't know. God, I made mistakes and I don't feel saved. But the Word of God, the promises of God overpower that doubt and overpower that fear. And sometimes those fears are irrational. And we need to be mindful of the fact that God's promises, God's words, God's commitments, and our faith in response to that needs to overpower our emotional response. And Abraham could have responded out of emotion, and the ending of this story would be much different, but he didn't. He didn't. He responded out of faith and commitment and trust in God and His Word and obedience. And that's what we see. The Hebrew writer picks up on this in Hebrews 11 as he champions these heroes of faith like Abraham. But in Hebrews chapter 11, it says this and gives us some insight into what was going on. By faith, he says, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. And it was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. So that was his expectation, right? That in Isaac there would be this great nation, that there would be a huge family, and that was what Abraham was expecting. And verse 19 gives us some insight into Abraham's thinking. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. That's his faith. That God is able to raise even people back from the dead. God is able. God is able. God is able to keep His promises. God is able to fulfill His word. God is able to do what He says He's going to do, even when that thing seems impossible. Even when I've never seen anything like that before, even when I've never experienced anything like that before. I have never seen anybody raised from the dead, but I believe it's possible. I believe it will happen, and I believe it has happened because I trust that God is able. And that's where Abraham was. He was at a place in his life where he knew God's word, he knew what God had asked him to do, but he trusted that God was able, even if that required God to raise the son in which he sacrificed back to life. He believed that that was possible. And the text says that in a sense, right, he did receive him back. Now, we know the story. He didn't actually offer his son. He was stopped and something was put in place. We'll read about that in a minute. But that's the story, isn't it? That in a sense, he did. He did. His son lives, even though he technically offered him on the altar of sacrifice. And then going back to Genesis 22 and verse 13, it says, and then Abraham raised his eyes. Right? Remember the last time we saw that phrase? He raised his eyes and he saw the place in which God had told him to go. And we just imagined sorrow and disappointment and heartache. But now he raised his eyes again and he looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. I don't know if you've been around animals for any length of time. Anytime you ever have an animal, a goat or something caught, I mean, how quiet is that, right? I mean, how many of you have ever seen an animal caught and just seen it just dead silent? Unless it was actually dead. But I mean, if it's living, it's going to be making noise. I mean, there's rare that you see something stuck and it's just quiet. But for some reason, they didn't see it, And that's part of the mystery of the story, of course. But they didn't recognize it. They didn't see it. But he looked up and there it was, right in the thicket. The ram caught by its horns. And Abraham went and he took the ram, excitedly, I imagine, and he offered him up as a burnt offering in the place of his son, as a substitute, as a substitutionary sacrifice, so that his son would live and the animal would perish. And Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. You see, we do not serve a God who lies and misleads people. We do not serve a God who lies and misleads. That's something that we do as humans. We do that kind of stuff. We lie, we mislead, and sometimes we lie and mislead ourselves. But we do not serve a God who lies and misleads people, who makes promises that he cannot keep. We do, however, serve a God who is able and who is willing. We do serve a God who makes promises and he keeps them. We do serve a God who provides. And it's hard, isn't it? It is hard not to read this story and see the parallels between the story of Jesus as God is offering his only begotten Son, as God provides the Lamb, his only Son, and that would shed his blood for the forgiveness of the sins of the world, through whom God will bless all nations. It's hard as Christians to even read this story without constantly thinking about the cross, thinking about Jesus, thinking about God's willingness and plan through him to bring about our salvation. And as we see God keep his promises to Abraham, as we see God keep his promises to Abraham and bless all nations through his seed, it gives us hope. It gives us the hope and the confidence that we need, that the unseen, the unknown, will suddenly become known and realized. That someday, those things that we know are going to happen because we were told they're going to happen, even though we've never seen them happen, and we've never seen anything like it before, and we've never experienced it before, we know that God is able and God is willing, and that he will provide and he will keep his promises. And that's where we hang our hat, isn't it? That's where we put our hope. That someday we're going to look up and we're going to see the promise of God being fulfilled as Jesus returns and brings about the resurrection and the new reality that we're so looking forward to as Christians. And that's where we need to be. I want us to think about Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. Jesus is talking to his talking to his disciples rather, and he's giving them some kind of last minute instructions here about what they needed to expect as disciples of Christ and what kind of sacrifices they need to make. And I think this is really sobering and in light of what we've just read. But Matthew chapter 10, starting at verse 37, says, "He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake will find it." To take up our cross, to take up our tree, and to follow Jesus up the mountain. That's what we're called to do. Knowing very well that in the mountain, the Lord will provide. That's the hope we have. That we follow, knowing very well that we are carrying the very tree of our own execution. We're following, knowing very well that the end of that journey is going to ultimately end in death. Regardless of whether we die of old age in faithful service to Jesus, or we die in persecution, or however that might be, that ultimately that's where we're headed, and we're giving up everything. We're giving up all of our life's interests. We're giving up all of our things that we love in this world that will keep us from following Jesus, in this willingness to go up the mountain with him and carry our own tree, this willingness to bear upon us the cross, to lose our life in the process, that we believe that God is able. Don't we? Don't you believe that? Do you believe what Abraham believed when he said, and he thought, and he believed that God is able to raise even people from the dead? You know, that journey for us didn't just begin when we believed, but it began when our belief and our trust led us to acts of obedience, didn't it? when we believed and we committed ourselves to Jesus and we were baptized for the remission of our sins, and that believing that coming up out of the water, that not only will God forgive us of all the sins that we had committed, but that motion, that act foreshadows the very fact that someday we will go into the grave, that we will go into the ground, and that God will ultimately raise us up again. And that's our hope. That's our expectation. And all through the Bible, we see stories like this one that teach us that is what God is going to do. If you believe in Jesus, if you believe that he's been raised from the dead, if you believe that God will raise you from the dead in faithfulness to Jesus, this is this opportunity to be buried with him in baptism, have your sins forgiven, show that kind of belief and commitment and faith through acts of obedience, and be saved from this perverse generation. Maybe you've done that and you haven't quite lived up to the expectation that follows. Maybe you have gone back to your first love, the world, and this is a good opportunity to repent of that and come back to following him. If there is a need this morning, would you please come forward as we stand and as we sing?